Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ruth Dunwoody and I am representing the Clinical Education Unit at the School of Health and Rehab Sciences in the University of Queensland. We have a number of clinical education initiatives run from our unit, and today we are hosting a webinar which focuses on feedback for learners. So just a couple of, before we get into it, just to explain the webinar format, you can see me and hear me at the moment. In a second or two, I'm about to share the PowerPoint presentation with you, so you should be able to see the slides and still hear my voiceover for that. I cannot see or hear anyone who's participating in this webinar. So to facilitate some interaction, there's a chat function, which looks like a little talk bubble within your view, and you can use that in the same way that you would to send a message through Messenger or WhatsApp or something like that. I will be able to see those messages, and my intention is that at the end of the webinar, unless there's something of a technical nature that needs to immediate attention, that I'll try and address those questions or comments towards the end. Now, the purpose of chat is to give me a de-identified message. So I would like to say that if there's anything that you're asking for us to follow up on or to send through to you, that you identify yourself or that you send a separate email after the webinar such that we can interact and follow up with you. The other thing that will happen throughout this webinar is that I have some polls. We're going to start off with one, like a short questionnaire, only 3 or 4 questions, and at the end, 3 or 4 questions just to get some feedback on this format and whether or not it was beneficial for you and useful. We're very much committed here in our clinical education unit to ensure that the material that we provide for you is actually helpful and useful for you as practitioners in your environment when working with learners. So it's important that we gain some feedback from you on that. Appreciate your responses when we get to that. Okay, so with that then said, I'm about to share a screen, so I will drop off and you'll see now the PowerPoint presentation from here. Hopefully you can all see that now. Okay. So, in looking at feedback for learners, the aims of the session are to review the importance of feedback in the learning process, and we'll talk a little bit about some literature support and some practical tips and things throughout this webinar, such that you can get a better understanding of that. We know that providing feedback and providing effective feedback can be quite different, and so we're going to consider the influences on providing effective feedback. We want to look at quality within that process as well, and the elements that underpin that, and hopefully provide you with some strategies for delivering challenging or difficult feedback, or for some pointers to at least steer you in the right direction. We've broken it up into 4 sections, and as I said, we'll concentrate on different areas. So feedback for learning and the influence in the process is the first one. Quality feedback, effective feedback, and challenging feedback. Looking at the first one then, why is feedback important to the learning process? Well, we've got a little bit of a snapshot from some of the vast literature that is published on feedback. And if we look first of all at it allows the learner to know what is desired and what is actual. Okay, so that can be quite different. Your learners and your students might suggest that they've heard the feedback and they know that we're there on track, but they might not have an appreciation of what they're currently doing in that space and what is the desired outcome in that space. So that's where feedback, the role of feedback comes into that. Also, the importance of feedback suggests that it promotes a deep learning, because hopefully as a result of the whole process, the learners will gain an enhanced understanding of the information that's communicated. Feedback supports the learning relationship, which is integral to learner success. So we know from previous workshops and from our previous work with learners that one of the biggest influences is the learning relationship and the learning environment. And so if we don't establish a relationship with some good feedback rules and some good feedback interactions, then the chances are that relationship won't be supportive of the learning process. There's also some suggestion, particularly from Hattie and Timberley, that there's a real power to feedback and that it can really influence positively and negatively the outcomes for students. And this is echoed in a number of other models and perspectives from the literature, which we will draw on in the coming slides. Feedback is also considered formative assessment, and we know that assessment drives learning in our students. Therefore, we really promote that we use that notion to label and to name and make our feedback explicit and overt in the whole learning process. Students are generally motivated by the assessment. Therefore, if we link feedback and assessment together, then that provides a motivation to change. In the background literature as well, there's I guess three domains of feedback areas where one focuses particularly on feedback as information. So information is given to a learner and they take that on board, and that could be the end of it. We hope that they do something about that, but we don't actually know. The other one is feedback by action. So give the students some feedback and there's a definite, yes, do this differently, and they perform that task. Then there's literature moves a little bit more into a more dynamic kind of area, and it looks at this concept of feedback as being cyclical, where learners are expected to receive the information and respond on that leads about an improvement, but that whole process is cyclical at any point. It's dynamic and involves a degree of reflection as well in that process. So it no longer becomes just do this or here's some feedback and information, but that there are actually a depth to the learning occurs as we incorporate feedback as cycle. Continuing then with the notion that feedback is a bit more dynamic, these authors, and they published in Clinical Teacher, so they're a collaboration of Australian and New Zealand authors in medical education and clinical education. And they are proposing a model that really focuses on the student as central to that. So this is a student-centered feedback model. Now, the graphic that they used I wasn't able to reproduce, so I have adapted their model to include all the key elements and reflect it in this graphic. So at the center of this is the student, and you'll see to the left and to the right, there's labels of supervision and context. What that indicates to us that obviously these are going to have a big influence on the learner and what they hear, what they respond to, and what they do. So it's important that we consider things from our context like, and we might substitute the word environment for this. We might suggest that the timing or the structure or the agenda of our feedback, whether we're giving it to individuals or whether we're giving it to a group, those kind of aspects are important in the context, and they will determine whether or not the learner is actually going to be using the feedback that we provide. The other influence then on the imposing side is the supervision. So supervision refers to the style of supervision that is given, the expertise that's provided by the supervisor, the interpersonal skills that supervisor might have to be able to impart knowledge and experience to the student. So if we look at those as influences in this model, and then we look to, well, what about the student themselves? So they're a key driver in this model, and ideally they need to be receptive, responsive, and reflective to the feedback. So probably in a different order. So receptive to the feedback, reflective on the feedback, and responsive to that. So the types of things that we expect the learner to demonstrate within those domains. So if we expect a student to be receptive, we expect them to monitor their own progress, to seek feedback themselves, to drive that almost, to create opportunities themselves to receive that feedback and take in the information both from the context and from the supervision influences. We then expect them to have some insight into their own performance and think about their own actions and their role within the particular interaction or context or clinical environment that they're in. We also want them then to be responsive and be able to act on, receive and process that feedback in a manner that brings about a direction for them to change. So the above influences, if you like, are key elements in factoring into the quality of feedback. So these authors are presenting this as a bit of a shift from what traditionally has been educator-driven or supervision-driven feedback, and in previous times perhaps a more focus on a linear process, to this being very much student-led, with the student being at the centre. And I want to draw on this model because I think it's a really nice model. And we talk about engaging active learners all the time, and I just want to use this model as a way to perhaps engage reflection in ourselves and challenge the way in which we interact with our learners in clinical practice settings. We also then know that good feedback, quality feedback, improves learning outcomes because the student themselves is the biggest influence on their own learning outcomes. This is the whole premise behind this model, that the student at the centre has the power to influence whether or not they do well or don't do well if we adopt this kind of model. So it might be easier said than done, but hopefully we can give you some tips along the way to have a look at how we might improve the quality of our feedback. Which then segues nicely into the next section, and building on that model from Rutland, looking at the factors that then affect the quality. So we've talked about the learner themselves as being receptive and reflective and responsive. We also want to know that the learner is ready, that they have a readiness for the particular activity of learning, that they also understand the context of the feedback that is being delivered to them and how it relates to, I guess, their learning objectives, but also, perhaps it might be patient outcomes, etc. That is the consequence, and the understanding of where that feedback sits. So a learner who's not ready and who doesn't really understand the relevance is not going to do anything with that feedback. It will fall on deaf ears. Also, A major factor is the clinical educator themselves or the supervisor and how they go about facilitating the process of feedback. So I mentioned a little bit about, a linear kind of direction of feedback that perhaps we might have experienced in our own education. And, these days we really promote active engagement, we promote critical thinking, we promote students to engage in a way that might present or might look like we're challenging educators. And so our responses and our own interpersonal skills are really critical to optimize that interaction. Now, equally so, we might promote that in our students, but in practice, our students might not risk that or have the confidence to engage with their educator in a dialogue situation. So I guess that what we're looking for you to do is to hold in your understanding that if I can be open and responsive and receptive to perhaps a dialogue or an exploration of something, that the student will risk more and be confident to engage and drive the feedback process better. And, I don't expect either, having seen enough students in practice, I don't expect that this happens immediately, but that repeated attempts for learners to be in clinical environments working with a variety of educators over time is definitely going to influence the way in which they interact within that learning process. So it's very important that we understand our own skills, our own values, our potential biases as well, and that we have some self-reflection on how that might come out in the way in which we interact with the student and the feedback that we provide. So if we roll our eyes when a student does something that's wrong or not to the standard we expect, or even in fact, if they've done something again that you've already previously addressed, then that's not going to send a message to the student that will empower them and encourage them to engage a little bit more in their understanding of the message that we're trying to send them. So it's important that we examine our own interpersonal skills and recognise the contribution that has to the quality of feedback. And looking at the context, I mentioned a little bit about this before, but we might have students who are placed together on placement, so two or more students working in the same clinical area or assigned to the same clinical educator. Sometimes students begin to feel like their feedback is given to them always as a group because everything applies to everyone and that they don't take away an individual message. So how we set that up is important to the quality of the feedback given. So considering the number of students, considering the time that we have available and how we might optimise that, considering the learning culture of the organisation or the clinical area as well that we're into, and I'll talk a little bit about that next. Learning culture has been, there's I'm quoting an article here that it's done interestingly in some non-health literature. It looks at musicians and athletes, funnily enough, but it's got some really good transferable and generic points about the culture related to feedback. And it's suggesting that to get the most out of your learner, if you engage in activities and create a culture that promotes trust, and again adds to that relationship I talked about a little bit earlier, whereby you define the expectations for both the learner and the teacher in that relationship, then that goes a long way to improving the culture and improving the quality of the feedback that's given. Another important point that came out of this article was that we need to consider that feedback is normal, that it becomes an everyday in an informal capacity, because I recognise that some people might interpret feedback as it's quite structured and set aside time, and time is precious, we don't always have time. But looking at, the expectation that it is normal to receive feedback regularly and in different forms. And we would promote that to be an explicit dialogue from learner and educator to come to an agreement such that the expectations are understood. Also looking at, and this is something that I think we do in most of our professions within the physio, OT and speech and audiology, is that we have some clear goals, whether they be assessment outcome goals, whether they be learning contract goals, that we define what the performance within those goals should look like, and that the learner has something to work towards. So that becomes the desired outcomes, and they can measure their performance with their actual performance along the way as a progression and a dynamic pathway. So we really want to create that learning culture that looks at expectations, norms and relationships. The other thing about that is, though, that we might put a lot of effort into that. It doesn't necessarily define good feedback, okay? What we need to do is create opportunities. So this is where the culture itself and the environment in which we're in need to come together. We need to create the opportunity and the right conditions for the learner to trust, to feel empowered, and ultimately to take the lead. So we're looking for the learner to respond and the outcomes ultimately that the learner is working towards to be achieved. So feedback is no good unless we bring about change in performance. So that leads a little bit into the delivery of quality of feedback. I mentioned in the last slide about empowering the student. So the whole student-centered model is one that really, a part of that aim is for them to lead it and for it not to be educator-driven. So it's student-driven, it's student-led. Now, again, it's easier said than done. Many students, because of the perceived power differential that exists in the whole learning situation, students are possibly reluctant to lead their own feedback and their own learning and drive that process unless they are supported to do so, empowered to do so, and given permission to do so in some cases. So we really would like you to create, through your feedback, the opportunity for the learner to take on the role of preparing for, seeking and optimizing that feedback. So that might, I guess we could say, yes, we engage the students and we ask them a few questions. We might say to them, what do you think is, how are you going in this particular skill set, or what did you think of that interaction that you just had? And then what happens is we hear a response from the student. It may be in depth, it may not be, and in my experience, it's generally not very in depth. And then we'll talk at the student from there on and say either yes, we agree, or we don't agree, and here's some more things to do, and it becomes a little bit more supervisor-driven, educator-driven. So what we really would like to do is to create that situation whereby the student clearly knows when they're on placement that the feedback and the learning that they gain from this experience will be dependent on their participation in that and how they prepare, how they seek, and how they use that feedback. So, you might want to ask them to really focus and reflect on particular aspects and then only respond to their questions. And that might be a little challenging at first. If you say we're going to set aside 15 minutes for a feedback session, and I want you to really ask me for that direction, show me what particular things you've been working on and where you believe your skills need to be improved, and I can facilitate a change or make a few suggestions, but I will respond to you. So if they don't do that well, they won't gain a lot of feedback from you. And then the next time you do it, you might suggest that the session didn't take a lot of they didn't engage in a lot of that structure that you set up for them, so like try and do it a little bit differently next time, and try again and try again and try again. Then eventually they'll get the understanding of, yep, it's okay for me to risk, yes, it's okay for me to tell you what I don't know, you're not going to come down on me hard, and we enter into a more mature dialogue about performance, which is essentially student-led and leads to better quality of feedback, better utilisation of that feedback, and ultimately greater outcomes for the student. So again, some of these authors have supported the fact that the skills and the relationship on both sides is very important to the outcomes and the delivery. Some would suggest that if the educator is giving particular information, that you don't make it too vague, too discreet, or too direct, because that way students might miss the message. They might miss the point. Even if you're quite specific and direct, they might not really understand the context. They might need the opportunity to unpack that a little bit more. And so it's important that you give time to dialogue that and explore that further. I talked about actual and desired before. Essentially, quality feedback needs to bridge the gap, and if it doesn't, then it's not useful. It's not feedback. It's not going to affect the outcome of the learner whatsoever. We should generally focus on a task. Now, you would have heard that in previous, education or training or literature or whatever around working with individuals, that you don't really have a conversation about them personally. You look more to focusing on the task at hand, the deliverables that are expected, and the pathway that they will get to that, rather than the learner's capabilities or who they are as a person and what they bring when you're delivering feedback. We can explore that in a more relational sense, as in a conversation. Should the learner raise that as an issue, you can certainly engage with them. And I've got some slides at the end that relate to challenging feedback and personal interactions. The other powerful thing about quality feedback is that the need for reflection is integral to that process. So if there is no reflective element to receiving feedback, then it will not be applied in a meaningful way. So we need to look for feedback that occurs in action, whereby students can reflect on what is actually happening here and how can I do this differently to bring about a better outcome. It can be difficult for learners to do that, particularly if it's an early stage learner. So, or someone who's undertaking their first clinical placement, or a second year student in an observation kind of facilitated role might not risk any depth of reflective practice and interaction. But you really hope that a final year student who's used to the clinical environment and who's close to graduating would be able to respond faster and in real time to take on board and be critical and reflective of their own interactions and recognise when things are not working. I talked about the power differential before, and just a comment to say that how that can be minimised is through joint or shared learning as one option. And so doing things together and letting the student know that we are a team in this particular client interaction can support their confidence to risk the dialogue that otherwise they might not have. We also talked about the feedback, delivering feedback needs to be a conversation. It needs to be a dialogue, not a one-way. It needs to allow for the reflection and the synthesis of it and the exploration of it. We expect students to be able to monitor themselves, to know where they're at and what they need, and that is a learned skill. That is a skill that, that develops whilst they're in clinical practice in the same way that clinical skills develop through exposure, facilitation, and practice. Quality feedback is vital in individualising it to the learners. We talked a bit about, a group of learning and providing group feedback. It's, kind of gold standard, if you like, of feedback is that it's individualised to that learner. It's not broad brush strokes. It takes account of their pathway, their journey, their styles, their mistakes that they've made, their learning hopes and outcomes for contract, their learning goals, etc. So that you try and you tailor or refer to, incorporate the journey that they are taking whilst they're with you, and design that feedback specific to them. We also know that quality feedback maintains a bit of a balance. So there are always positive and constructive or negative aspects to performance, and it's what we do with that that's critical to bringing about the change. And this is where we can influence, and through the powerful influence that feedback has, we can either negatively or positively affect a student in their delivery of something different. So we need to focus on what needs to be improved, to meet the standards required, or to meet the objectives, or to, provide a different client outcome. We're not looking at feedback necessarily if it doesn't have to have an improvement. So where time is tight, focus on what needs to be improved. Specificity is always better than vague, obviously, and a trick for that is to relate it to what you see in the observed behaviour of the student. So looking at the evidence that you've gathered about how they interact, not what you think they might do under any given context, but what you've seen them do, and help them to change that in that situation. And we also know that, and I'm a bit guilty of this, that you can see lots of opportunities to enhance the learning of a learner, and somewhere in there, as you're telling them all about the possibilities, they can lose focus on the key points. So it's important that we reiterate what are the key messages that we're sending. This is a little acronym of what quality feedback is all about. So PROMOTED is the acronym, and I'll leave that with you. We can send out slides is the other thing. We will send out a recording of this webinar for you, and we can also send out the slides to participants. I think you've given your email to us in logging on, so whoever's email we have, we'll send that to them. Just to move on with that one. But well, kind of sensible approaches here that we've talked about relates to SMART goals and those sorts of things as well, considering the time, considering its measure, considering the specific, etc. We also need to recognise that learners come at different stages and that learners learn at different rates. And so you may come across students who, are from the same programme and the same year level, and some are much better than others at managing the same level of tasks. So we would suggest that you need to alter the way in which you deliver your feedback and create the student-centred feedback approach to meet that learner where they're at. So, for example, if we compare the successful learner and the struggling learner, looking at someone who's struggled, you'll need to connect dots for them to make sense of the process. Whereas in the successful learner, if you focus on the task at hand, they will follow the process that manages the task often, because they have a depth of understanding and probably a stronger knowledge base to be able to perform that task. Similarly, the successful learner often has a good direction, like a clarity about, excuse me, about how they go about undertaking the tasks that have been assigned. So they'll have a specific and clear direction to undertake that. Whereas the struggling learner will need you to break the task down into more manageable chunks and scaffold the learning for them. The successful learner will demonstrate higher level communication skills in their interaction or conversation about the topic. So they will, you'll be able to see or hear from that conversation what they're thinking about. So they will perhaps ask a question that's of a deeper level, or fill in the gap themselves by suggesting that this might be a good way to go, because what I understand of the situation is this. Whereas the supporting the struggling learner, you're going to have to draw self-referencing, so get the learner to draw on what worked last time and how they can apply some of those things to bridge this current gap that's here. So they're not necessarily going to run with it, make those connections in a proactive way. They're much more dependent on you connecting the dots, as we said before, but also allowing them to use what they've been successful in before to bridge the gap now. Successful learner as well, so the feedback that we give will allow that learner, as we talked about, empower that learner to drive the process and their outcomes, i.e. the whole progress. With the struggling learner, you would need to check for understanding along the way, because they're not necessarily going to know what comes next or know what they were working on unless you check with them that they understand the feedback that you were trying to give them. Okay, the other thing is we often get asked about the order in which we provide the balance of feedback, the positive versus the negative, the sandwich of, good, not so good in the middle, finishing off with something good. The jury is out on whether or not the order is important. But I just thought I'd like to give you an alternative to the feedback sandwich that's proposed by Angelo, and that is to look at, well, we can start with what's done well, what is the good news here, and then what needs to improve. But we don't then stuff in, oh well, and you're finishing off with something good again. You're actually focusing a little bit more on this needs to improve. Now, what options have we got in front of us? So you're helping the learner to actually do something with the feedback. So they, again, can lead that and they can explore what options do they have that suit them. Then what does the learner intend to do? So what am I going to do about that? And then the commitment of, all right, that sounds like a good plan. What are we going to agree to do from here? So you're actually facilitating that whole student-led process by giving them two pieces of information initially. One, what's done well. Two, what you need to work on. Now let's engage here a little bit more. What do you understand? What are the options? How can it, does it suit you? How can this be used a bit more beneficial to your learning, and what do we agree to? Okay, so moving on then to effective feedback, and a lot of what we've said thus far is going to feed into this. We know that effective feedback is better where it's facilitated. It doesn't want to be just directive. So as we've talked about, incorporate reflection, incorporate dialogue, and exploration of the messages that are intended to send. How the student interprets and deals with feedback is critical to the success of that assessment. So if we look at what the students or the learners might expect from the feedback that you've given, they're going to attach some meaning to that. They're going to do that through a method of, they're going to have some internal markers. They're going to think, well, is this relevant, and does this person have credibility? And if they don't, then I'm going to throw it out. I'm not going to do something with it. So really that's where the environment of and our supervision context comes into play there. We need to convince the students that we have expertise in this area that will help them move forward. So when I say expertise in the area, not clinical expertise necessarily, but that you have expertise in managing their struggles and being able to move forward or extend their learning beyond where they currently are at. I mentioned too that negative feedback can evoke strong emotional reactions, and the emotion might be the barrier to the receptivity of the feedback to be used in a positive way. So again, just be mindful about the emotional responses that occur within the context in which any feedback is being delivered or explored. And then this is a really nice point, I think, that feedback is most powerful when it addresses faulty interpretations, not a total lack of understanding. So starting with what is known is a great way to say, okay, at some point, what you know to be true and what you're doing here has got a bit of a breakdown, a faulty interpretation, because you're not applying it necessarily in the way that it's intended to be applied, which is resulting in, suboptimal performance, if you like. So looking at that and exploring the interpretations that the student has will allow them to support the fact that they have understood to a point and then they've misinterpreted, and that might be the critical junction for which they need the gap to be plugged. Not that they feel as though they totally got that wrong and they didn't really understand, and now that they're confused because they're frightened to apply that same process again. Feedback must be conceptualized as a supported sequential process rather than a series of unrelated events. So again, that's building on from one thing to the next. How can we draw on what we've learned? What can you bring to this that you understand about your own performance and yourself? Help us go forward from here, or help me go forward from here, is the state that you want the learner to be in. Students' perceptions about feedback. There's a couple of articles that were done here in Australia and Sydney around 2008, 2009, and looked at the students' perceptions of feedback. So I mentioned that, that the credibility of the CE is important. Timing, they want positive, they want it to be clear, they want it to be individualized, and it's not good enough to give them feedback that's just about closing the gap. It needs to be about, not giving them feedback about what they haven't done. It needs to be information that helps them to close the gap and to improve. So we would call that, strategies to improve, perhaps. Equity and fairness is also another big factor in the student population. They want to know that they're being treated fairly and that you're applying, I guess, the rules of this, probably more related to feedback about assessment, which learners often anchor back to, that they want to know that you are transparent in that and that you're not providing one set of rules for them and another set of rules for another learner. We know that effective feedback produces effective learning, and it's really up to the combination of learner and educator to create the conditions in which this progress can be made and the gap can be closed. So just another note on closing the gap. The students will, so Hattie and Tim Pillay have written a little bit on this, and it's a pretty good article to read if you ever get a chance to read it. But essentially students will try and close the gap in two ways. They'll either respond and increase their effort, adopting strategies to manage that situation. Or what they'll do is they will throw the towel in, abandon it, shut down, reduce or blur the goal. Okay, so what they'll do is they'll try and make the goalposts a little bit closer to them. So they'll alter the perception of what is required. So our role in that then is to recognise that they might do these types of actions or share these perspectives and be able to identify appropriate, specific and challenging goals that support and facilitate their learning towards hopefully increasing their effort. Okay, so we don't want the abandoned actions, we want the positive efforts in the direction of closing the gap where possible. This is also another model which is often quoted, and it's a nice one because it looks at, I've just circled the area that I wanted you to focus on there, and it looks at you know, the notion of feeding forward. So we talk about feedback, but the feedback is, you know, only part of it. We need to know what we're going to do with it next time. So they use the terms speed up, feedback, and feed forward. Where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? And this model looks quite busy, and I'll try and interpret it for you. But what it suggests is that with every kind of there are, you know, a number of levels that we might expect the learner to undertake. So at the task level, process level, at their understanding of monitoring and directing, and of their own ability to critically analyse and think, that we would apply these three questions: where am I going, how am I going, and where to next. At the task level, it's more simple. So, you know, what do I understand of this task in front of me? How am I going with that task? And what do I need to do to improve on that task would be the example. So feed up, feedback, feed forward. And so that's a good little model or some prompt questions to help direct the conversations that you will have with students. Okay, so moving on to the last section now, and this is really looking at some of the, you know, the challenging feedback that educators might say to us. You know, this is really difficult for me. I understand process, I understand learning objectives, and I'm usually pretty okay with feedback until there's an elephant in the room that relates to a more personal nature or an emotional nature, or something that might draw on our own biases and our own triggers that makes that engagement and interaction much more difficult to engage with the student. So when the task and the skill that you're trying to provide feedback on is easy to manage, but when there's a personal attribute or something about this individual that's impacting on the learning, that we really need to address. How do we do that? Now, I've put up a couple of examples there. That this is not to say that we come across this often, but you know, just to make the point, it could be that you have someone that's pretty scruffy or who has some BO during their placement, and nobody wants to be around them. So, as a clinical educator, what that then does for your behaviour is you don't want to be in a room with them for any length of time. So everything's done on the hop, everything's done on the run, or you might even email them instructions so that you don't have to go through things with them, etc., etc. So whilst you're taking on board, you know, the tasks and the feedback about their performance might be quite fine, there's a real elephant in the room about how they engage, or the influence of them being in the learning context or the clinical context, the effect it has on their colleagues, their peers, and indeed their clients as well. So it could be anything. Personal hygiene is just one. It might be that they have a particularly annoying habit that people are a bit reactive to. It might be that they need to stand up all the time, or click their teeth, or I don't know. There's a few things. I'm sure you can imagine what they might be. And also the personal space or the boundaries kind of issues as well, that are, they're hard to relate to the actual professional skill set that you're trying to teach, but that they might actually be impacting on the responsiveness of people in the relationship. So what do we do about that? We looked at, before we get on to that, there is a little article, and it's a bit, it's just a one-page kind of editorial. It's not a scholarly article by any manner, but it's quite a pointed article that it's called How Do You Tell a Student That They Smell? And what it does is it goes into, there are many ways in which you could do that. You could employ an external consulting agent to do the job for you. It's one extreme. You could send them an email. You could, do a number of strategies that are potentially quite disengaging from that person. But at the end of the day, you really need to examine, how does that learner feel in that situation? If everybody else is aware of an issue that they have, except the learner, and they've never actually been addressed. That's never actually been addressed with them. So that's a good little article just to read if anyone wants that, can forward that. But here's some of the tips that come out of that one, is that you have to, and they make sense, it's got to be one-on-one. You have to address it. One-on-one, comfortable and familiar environments are always better. Use a neutral language. Emphasize the professional aspect of the implications on the client relationship. So that's really about how this issue is influencing the client's relationship. Keep it simple and honest. Allow the students space and time to express their feelings. And you may well have some emotion expressed. Allow that to happen. Acknowledge it, verbal and non-verbal. Respond in an empathetic manner, in a professional relationship manner, and allow them to explore what the contributing factors might be. So space and time is possibly one of the critical factors of that, because that can make it go different directions. If a student is not willing to reflect on it, or can't reflect on it in a minute, then you're not really going to resolve that. You might want to build in, have a think about that. We can certainly revisit this if you'd like to. Let me know how I can help you with that if you're wanting to explore some issues, etc., etc. Okay, so we're almost finished. Just in looking at the summary of good feedback practice, make sure that we clarify what good performance is and the expected criteria, etc. It's a facilitated process that enhances the development of reflection and self-assessment, so that it's at the centre is the learner. They're the one who becomes to control and influence their behaviours and outcomes. high quality information to students about their learning, encourages dialogue, encourage positive motivational beliefs and self-esteem, so you want to empower the student, and provides opportunity to close the gap between current and desired performance, providing information to educators that can use to help shape the education. Okay, so there's a little bit of a summary. I'm mindful of time now, and I feel as though I've possibly rushed the last slide or so, but I would like to just conclude there and invite you to use the chat function if you have any questions, and I will attempt to answer them. So just have a look and see if you have any questions. So not yet, that's all good. And while we're doing that, I've also got some questions that I would like you to answer for me, if you might. So just going to launch the first one. There's only 4 or 5 questions in this. If you wouldn't mind answering these questions that are on your screen now. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. And then I'll finish off that one with 4 or 5 questions about the webinar in itself, for us to have some feedback on that would be great. Okay, let me see. Okay, so I have a couple of questions which I'll try and address. So, what feedback should be documented and how? So I think that might depend on the instructions and the particular context of that learner. So they will vary. I can talk from final year students in physiotherapy, etc. We have processes of formal feedback at midway and end of placement. And so it's important that we can provide some, some examples or some evidence about how you arrived at your decisions. And usually our instrument allows that to be documented in the comment field. So, that is sufficient for us. I know that there will be similar processes in other professions whereby examples really of behavioural performances or, client examples, etc. are what is used to support your decision making in assessing the student. Hopefully that helped to address that one. Another question. Okay, great. Do we have any handouts for CEs created on giving feedback? So we can certainly have a look at some of the tips and tools that we have in this presentation. I'll send this presentation around. If you'd like to give me your email address, I can certainly hand that round. Okay, great. We've got some good positive feedback there. All right, I'm just going to, before you disappear, just ask you to answer a couple more questions on the actual webinar itself. There's only 4 questions there, I think. 5 questions there, so it shouldn't take you too long to do. If you're still online, please respond to those questions now. And while you're doing that, I realise some of you might have had to go, so I'd just like to thank you for participating. We will review the responses that you send in. We will look to incorporate feedback in our subsequent webinars, but also in our whole education series. So, as I said at the beginning, it's very important for us to try and meet the needs of our educators in this process. So thank you very much and have a good afternoon.